he should be examined by scourging. Now, scourging is just as Jesus was scourged. Scourging is basically where they have this whip. It's basically like a whip, it's got a wooden handle, and it's got all of these little leather fragments coming off of it, and they have bone fragments and glass on this little whip. And so when they scourge you, when you hit someone with this whip, it basically rips through your skin. Now, this is not just like, when we look at the slaves were hit with a whip. Not like that. This is more like it's hard to describe, but it had many strings on it. It almost would look like a portion of a mop head. Yeah, and when they hit you, it would cut through to the skin, to the bone. In fact, many who were scourged, they died. They didn't last because they would bleed to death because of the scourging. And this was the Roman custom. So it says, he brought Paul into the barracks, and it said that he might be examined by scourging. Now, Paul understands what this is, and notice that Paul is really he's not talking about his rights just yet, but he is here shortly. He says, so that he might be examined by scourging, so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. Now, don't you find it pretty interesting that he brings Paul in, he's going to beat him, but he doesn't even realize why he's going to get him beat. He's not guilty according to the law, but he's going to find out by beating him. Verse 25. But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by. Now, basically, they stretched Paul out so that he wouldn't be moving around while they're trying to beat him. So they stretched him out, and they're about to beat him. And Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? That's interesting. It might not seem interesting to you, but all this time that Paul is going through this, he could have told them when he was first picked up that he was a Roman. He could have avoided all of this. But why would Paul allow himself to go through all this difficulty? I believe because Paul understood that these folk needed to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ. What are you willing to go through so that others might hear the gospel of Jesus Christ? What troubles are you willing to go through in your life? And so often in our lives, we're complaining about God to God when things happen, and our prayer is, God, please stop this. Make it go away. But ultimately, sometimes God allows us to go through things so that we might be able to comfort others when they go through it. This morning I snuck in Sunday school, Bo's talking about Jesus being on the boat. He told the disciples, we're going to go to the other side. And then the storm came. Isn't that just like life? You're headed in one direction and you think all is well, then all of a sudden the storm comes. And the waves start beating the boat, and you almost forget that Jesus told you that you are going to the other side, just as the disciples. And sometimes if we take our eyes off of Jesus and we start looking at the storms, we will become overwhelmed. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Somebody needs to know this morning, you need to take your eyes off of the storm and you need to put your eyes on Jesus. On that boat, they said to Jesus, But when they stretched him out with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and uncondemned? You just look at the face of this centurion. Countenance changes because now they got a problem. This is against even the Roman law to scourge a Roman. There were privileges associated with being a Roman. He says, and not only that, he's a man that is a Roman and uncondemned. Verse 26. When the centurion heard this, he went to the commander and told him, saying, what are you about to do? For this man is a Roman. In other words, Roger, we have a problem. Under our own law, we don't condemn Romans, and this man is identified himself as a Roman. Now, of course, Paul didn't have a dog tag on that says, I am a Roman. He probably didn't have a valid ID saying, I am a Roman. Because in this time, for someone to make a claim to be Roman and not be a Roman, that was a death sentence. So no one would say, I am a Roman, and they were not a Roman, and be not able to prove it. Because they would basically, this was like their passport. You don't carry your passport around, but you have a passport identifying you as an American citizen. So no doubt Paul had the background, he had this identification somewhere, but they don't even question it because they know that to make that claim, it has got to be true. And so it says in verse 27, the commander came in and said to him, tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, yes. The commander answered, I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, that's good for you. Translation. That's cool that you're a Roman, because you acquired this because you paid a whole lot of money. Well, top this. And Paul says, but I was actually born a Roman citizen. Trump that. Now, I want you to see that in all of this, God told Paul, and you remember a few weeks ago, on Paul's second missionary journey, he encountered several people who told him, don't go to Jerusalem. Remember that? Don't go to Jerusalem, because if you go to Jerusalem, they're going to lock you up and you're probably going to die. And Paul says, listen, I am willing to die for the sake of Jesus Christ. But ultimately, in the back of Paul's mind, he remembers that God tells him he is going to speak in Rome. He's in Jerusalem on his way to Rome. Listen, this is why you've got to know what God says. Because on the way to your journey, there are going to be obstacles. There are going to be storms. And if you lose sight of what God told you over here, you will lose heart over here. He says, and the commander answered, I acquired citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, I was actually born a citizen. Verse 29, therefore those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. I just love that. Listen, it does not matter what's going on the outside. It doesn't matter who's in charge. If God is for you, he is more than the world against you. He says and remember, Paul is not carrying around his Roman citizenship as a badge of honor, but in this particular case, he uses what is at his disposal. Because I'm a Roman citizen. Now, Paul probably Listen, you have access to people because of just being born where you're born. Take advantage of what God has given you. It says in verse 29, therefore those who were about to examine him immediately let go of him. And the commander also was afraid when he found out that he was a Roman and because he had put him in chains. Remember chapter 16. Remember when Paul was in prison before in chapter 16? And I just love Paul. They find out in chapter 16 and verse 35, it says, now when the day came, the chief magistrates, in chapter 16, verse 35, the chief magistrates sent their policemen saying, release those men. And you see how God has constantly been with Paul through all of this? He says, release those men. And the jailer reported the words to Paul saying, the chief magistrates have sent to release you. Therefore come out now and go in peace. But Paul said to them, no can do. They have beaten us in public without trial, men who are Romans, and have thrown us into prison, and now they are sending us away secretly? No, indeed. I love Paul. Paul is, he is something else. But let them come themselves and bring us out. The policeman reported these words to the chief magistrates when they were afraid that they had heard that they were Romans, and they came and appealed to them. And when they had brought them out, they kept begging them to leave the city. Can y'all just go? Oh, listen, my bad. Can y'all just go? Verse 40. They went out of the prison and entered the house of Lydia. And of course, this is where the church in Philippi was birthed. It says that when they saw the brethren, they encouraged them and they departed. And so, principle number 6, Paul's words are exposed. They expose Jewish privilege. Number 7, Paul's examination is curtailed by his heritage. Paul, as a Roman, is saved. God uses his Roman heritage to save him and to send him to his next place. Brings me to the last principle in verses 30 through 23:10. Paul's words are examined by the council. It says in verse 30, but on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused. And he still doesn't know why Paul is accused. The people want Paul dead. He doesn't want to riot, so he brings Paul into the barracks. And he finds out there that Paul is a Roman. But on the next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble and brought Paul down to set him before them. Paul, looking intently at the council, said, brethren, because he is a Jew, brethren, I have lived my life with a perfectly good conscience before God up to this day. Paul has a clear conscience. Paul is confident that all that he has done has been directed by God, so he has a clear conscience. No matter what happens, listen, in our lives, we need to have a clear conscience about our calling and representing Jesus Christ. So Paul says this. He says, I have a clear conscience before God up to this day. Verse 2 lets us know that Paul confronts abusive behavior. He confronts abusive behavior. Listen, the high priest, Ananias, commanded those standing before him to strike him on the mouth. Remember, Jesus was treated the same way. In the same court, Jesus was beaten and punched. But look at Paul's response. The thing